It was my first session, and the ANWR resolution came up. And I had always been against opening ANWR. And I knew my district was fine with that. In fact, they would have wanted me to do that. But I also knew that it would keep me from ever running for higher office in Alaska. I could never have run for U.S. Senate or governor or anything, having taken that one vote.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Beth Kerttula. She is the daughter of Jay Kerttula, who was first elected to the Alaska State House when Beth was just 3 years old. She grew up in between their farm in Palmer and the capital in Juneau, traveling back and forth with her parents. We talk about her own decision to run for the legislature shortly after her father had lost his re-election bid. A word about today's recording. I used Zoom from my new apartment in Juneau. I didn't have the best internet connection. Although I believe our guest sounds fine, you're going to be a little annoyed with the way I sound, and I am sorry for that.
Beth Kerttula, welcome to the podcast.
I'm so excited. Thank you, Andrew. Representative Gray.
Thank you. So, your grandfather,
Oscar.
Oscar Kerttula,
Kerttula. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Are you Finnish?
I lived in Finland for a couple of years.
You told me that. Nice job.
My Finnish is terrible. Let's be honest.
So is mine.
He came to Nome in 1918. Why was he at Nome in 1918?
Grandpa was a sailor, and he ran off at age 14. He took his stepbrother's birth certificate and went to sea. And that was it. He became ultimately a captain in the Navy, and he was a chief engineer, really is what he was. He was amazing. And so he was on a ship that got stuck in the late ice in the spring. And he was always very careful to point out he was not captain of that ship. But he went into Nome and bartered for milk, particularly with the Walsh brothers. And I don't know if you know my friend John Walsh, but he lobbied the legislature subsequently. And so there's these 3 generations of these 2 families that have known each other forever. It's pretty cool.
Wow.
He said the Walsh brothers' cow saved his crew.
That's so interesting. And so then your dad, where was he born?
He was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then they lived in northern Minnesota when the Depression hit. And my grandfather was a ship's engineer and a mechanic, but that was a bad time, and they had nothing. And he was quoted in a newspaper. This is a pretty cool quote about they had nothing there, so they were going north with hope. And they were part of an FDR alphabet agency called the Alaska Rural Rehabilitation Corporation, the ARRC. And so they came north as part of a colony intended to colonize, brought into the Matsu and given farms. And I think 35 families out of 200 stayed. And yeah. That was my grandparents' story, and they brought my dad up when he was 5.
He was 5 years old when he got to Palmer?
Got to Palmer, there was nothing there.
Wow. And did you know grandfather Oscar?
Oh, yes, I was so lucky. Yeah, he died young, but until I was 9. He was a great-grandfather. He was also ambidextrous. So I'd sit and watch him, and he could work on one piece of equipment while working on another. It was just mind-blowing. Even as a little kid, I knew that was pretty wild. And he took care of us a lot. My parents were farming and campaigning and very busy. And so Oscar took care of us a lot. He was a wonderful human.
Did he speak Finnish at home?
Yeah. He and my grandmother spoke Finnish at home. And I can hear it. When I hear it, I know it's Finnish. But I just know very few words. My grandmother had been badly discriminated against when she came to America at 9 and couldn't speak English. And she wanted to be sure our language skills were good. And so they didn't want us to understand Finnish. And that was a great loss. My father, however, spoke Finnish.
Your dad, commonly called Jay Kerttula, but
Jay.
Jalmar. Yeah.
Jalmar. Yeah. No H, but they still pronounce that. Yeah.
He served in the legislature for 34 years.
That's it.
How old were you when he got elected the first time?
That's so funny you asked. I was trying to think exactly that. How old was I when he was first elected? And I think I was 3. And my sister would have been 1. And he served his first term, and then he voted for an income tax. And he said if he could have had one more day, if he could have hit one more bar, he could have won the race. But he lost his second race. And so he was in Juneau when the earthquake happened, the big earthquake. And that was 69. It would have been his second term, but he lost that second try. And he was in Juneau when the earthquake happened. And my mom tried to get through. We were farming full time then, dairy farming. And so she tried to get through. And I remember when she got through, I was old enough to understand that Anna was too young still, but my mom got told that a tsunami had wiped out Juneau and no one was left. And I remember her standing there. God. Yeah, and I remember her standing there. This is so quintessentially my mom. And she said, I can't do anything about that now. I have 200 head of cattle to milk. And she just hung up the phone and went out. And we had one hired guy she could find. And they milked all those cows by hand. Yeah.
Do you remember the earthquake?
Oh, yeah. I was in the back seat of a car. And so was Anna. Anna and I were in the back. And my mom's up front. We were driving to the grocery store. And, it was a Good Friday. It was Easter time. And the car started to bounce. And I started to get out. And my mom just whacked me back to keep me from getting out. And we were in that car. And I remember geologists will say this can't happen, but it does. The ground was going in waves. It was waves. It was just like the ocean. And trees were whipping back and forth. And the truck next to us was bouncing higher than our car. And all of that seemed pretty interesting to me. But my mother said the problem for her was it went on so long. She started to become afraid that this was really going to be it because it was so long. I forget how long it was, but it was a long
4
period.
minutes.
See? Can you think of that as an adult? See, you're better than I. Can you imagine sitting there for 4 minutes with the ground and waves and everything shaking? We were lucky. Palmer was pretty much maybe 2 stories would be a big thing there. So we were lucky. We went in to the grocery store after it was all over. And then we had aftershocks. Of course, we went in the grocery store and they used to sell bunnies and chicks. Don't do that anymore. They were all in one little ball. Just all of them together, one little ball. Can you imagine how terrifying the whole thing was? Anyway, everything was broken on the floors. I guess my mom picked up bread and we went home. Yeah. We were so lucky. We didn't have any broken pipes. It's just no electricity. And it was fairly warm. So we were okay. We bundled up, but that's my memory. That and my mom being so brave.
When did she find out that your dad was actually alive?
Oh, after they got the cows milked, she got in earnest on the phone and she finally decided she'd call the governor's office. Such a small town in those days, really, the whole state. So she calls Governor Egan's office and George Sullivan, the subsequent mayor, but then I think chief of staff, George was there and he goes, oh, he's right here, Joyce. So Dad said there was like 2 inches, right? Everybody went to the highland, but there was like a 2-inch rise in the water. But that could happen. Juneau could conceptually have a tsunami, but it didn't. Obviously, it didn't happen.
I interviewed Joe Josephson, and he was serving in the legislature when the earthquake happened. And he remembers a fist fight breaking out in Governor Egan's office.
Between who?
I don't know, but he just said the tempers were so high. Everyone was trying to get back to Anchorage. No one could hear from their families. They didn't know if their families were alive.
Yeah. Terrible time. My dad flew home with Governor Egan on whatever big plane they had. And Dad was sitting next to Egan, and Egan would say, there was a village there. There was a village there. There was a village there. They were all gone in Prince William Sound. So, yeah, lots of people died that day.
Mhm.
And of course, Valdez burned. His
Right.
hometown burned. And I remember Valdez from being a little child as being just so beautiful. The old buildings that all burned
When did you start going to Juneau with your dad?
from day one.
Oh,
My
really?
parents, yeah, except that year he was coming back and forth. He was I think he lobbied, or he was an advisor or
So
something.
he worked as a lobbyist on those 2 years that he was out.
Yeah, but I don't know that it was formal lobbying. I actually never asked him. I doubt it was paid. So he was just back and forth. He loved politics. We all do. My whole family, we all love it. And he loved it. So he stayed in. And of course, he won his second race. And then he stayed in for the next 32 years.
What was that like growing up in Palmer and in Juneau, back and forth at the Capitol as a small child all the way through high school?
So it's a fun story. I was thinking about it because you told me you might ask this. So I was trying to think of what were my biggest memories. Some of it is that it was always so fun to be in the Capitol building as a child. And in those days, there was a museum on, I think it was the fourth floor, but I can't remember what floor. It was a state museum. Dr. Kytron, the manager of that museum, would always take Anna and me around. We were on fear of death if we did anything wrong by my mom. So we just had a wonderful childhood. It was very idyllic. We could go to that museum and he would tell us, I think to this day, I think that's where my sister, she's a PhD anthropologist. And I think that's where she started, just this wonderful stories about Alaskan history and the artifacts and what it all meant. And then in those days, a lot of families went to Juneau, the Tillians, the Crofts, others, but there were many families. And sometimes we all drove down together. So we'd meet wherever on the highway and go down in a caravan, which was a much safer way to do it in those days with those cars. Literally, I remember one night, my dad and Clem kept the cars running all night long just so they wouldn't freeze up. And the Crofts, Tony Croft, and the kids, that's Eric, and I don't remember which of his siblings, were in a car and it stopped. It was running and then just dead stopped. And my memory is that Tony said that the dog is what saved their lives. They had a great big German Shepherd and they all cuddled up with that dog until a truck came by and stopped and got them. I remember some of the funny things are we lived out of boxes. There were always boxes in and always boxes in Juneau. And, half the time you didn't unpack them all because you're just going to have to pack up again. And I remember we lost toys, right? We'd lose our favorite toys or our favorite clothes. And then 2 years later, they'd all show up. You had to be very flexible. My mother was a very intelligent, flexible, smart woman, and she just made it fun. So we always loved Juneau and always loved Palmer.
Clem Tillian was a Republican.
Yeah.
Your dad was a Democrat. And that wasn't an issue in their friendship?
No. And that was another good thing. My dad was about Alaska. He wasn't about having a bitter partisan fight. And neither was Clem. They'd fight on the floor and they'd go home and we'd have these wonderful dinners. Oh, the Stevens are an even better example, possibly. Ted and Dad were close until Ted died. Very close friends, always. And Anne and my mother were close. And so I remember one time, this will explain it maybe, they would trade off babysitting so they could go watch the floor, which both Anne and my mom were very interested in and, of course, part of. So Mom was babysitting Ted, Benny and Teddy in those days, Anna and myself, and we're all in the other room making all kinds of noise. And my mom said all of a sudden it went quiet. And so there was something wrong. So she ran in, she goes, "What's going on?" And one of us said, you mean you're Republicans? I said, you mean you're Democrats? And it was like, yeah, okay. And then we kept playing. There was so much camaraderie. I don't discount that there were definitely politics, but you had people like John Butrovich and, I can see Warren Taylor, people that were building a state. They knew it. Many of them had served in the Constitutional Convention, and they wanted the right thing. Some of them did. There were some of them would just vote the party line all the time, but most of them stepped back from that and really focused on what was good for the state.
That's a funny story. My son, he's the same age as Justin Ruffridge from Sultana's son. And we've done dinners together and they played. And there was a very similar thing where in the car, he was like, they're Republicans?
I know. It's good for kids to get that understanding at an early age.
I'm going to tell you a random story because my phone is next to me and someone just sent me a text.
Sure.
So my husband and I and our son, we live in my district in Anchorage.
Yes.
We bought our house from Judith Anderegg and Dave Pelto. And she worked in your dad's office, I think. And she just sent me a text while we're on the phone. And I haven't heard from her in a long time. This is the universe, the energy that's going out. Judith just sent me a text.
I love that. I believe in that, don't you? I love that. So Judith Anderegg worked for my dad for a long time, but moreover, I grew up with her husband, David. David and Bill Pelto lived in the house, and they're Finnish as well. So they lived in the house next to ours when we were in Juneau on Star Hill, and we had a gang. We had 4 boys, 2 from their family, 2 with the Peels, and Anna and me, and we were just, it was begin. Juneau was great. Palm was great. I got to watch the beginning of the state, live in the capital, go to really good schools, hang out with my friends, do drama programs, and then go home in the summer to the farm with Anna.
We live in their house. And when we bought the house, the condition was that I had to go to community council meetings. And so I'm a legislator because we bought a house where they're like, you've got to go to the community council meeting because we're leaving and we need somebody to replace us at the community council. So,
I love that. Yeah. I just love that. That's fantastic.
I want to talk about a little bit more about your parents.
Please.
I mean, it's notorious that your mother was essentially his chief of staff. She ran the office. I've heard she ran a very tight ship, and it was your mother who was driving that tight ship.
So I only realized how much my mother did. And even though I understood it, I had volunteered. Both my sister and I volunteered and worked for my dad for free. And in those days, I will say, I think one thing it's been hard to watch, and I think it needs to be revisited, is some of the ethics rules have gotten so complicated that you can't let a volunteer do as much as they would do in those days. I mean, there was nothing, in my opinion, ever wrong with it. My mother didn't get paid a cent. And at any rate, here's how it worked. My mother and dad were a team. They were a team from day one, whether they were running the farm or they were running for office or he was in office. But my mother was always very clear that at the end of the day, it was my dad's vote. That was never in question. But she was an English teacher. She was from Oklahoma. She came to Alaska to teach, met my dad. That was it, right? But she had worked in Los Alamos. And if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, she was there. She's the first woman to see the atomic bomb explode. And she was just a really strong, very centered person. So he did run his office all those years. They had terrific staff, terrific. These people, Jenny Dawson will be my sister forever. And the whole office worked as a team. And I can say that because I worked for them one year. In that one year, when he was in a minority in the Senate, he got 11 bills passed one year, and 9 of them were substantive, quite substantive. So that's the kind of thing that you can build. She was on it, man. You worked, but she was also deeply understanding and thoughtful. And if anything happened to somebody's family, that was like a given. You could go do anything you needed to do. And so it was a great experience for me to see how a great office worked. And I tried to emulate that. I similarly always had pretty tremendous staff.
Having watched your mom run the office, when you decided to run, did you tell your husband, now here's what's going to happen?
Oh, yeah. But he was an indefatigable campaigner. I had a very tough first race. And it was all in the primary, right? Because Juneau is so heavily Democratic. Jim was awesome as a campaigner. And he and I would talk endlessly about the legislature, but no, he would have had to have had his own job. We were young and not financially well off. So yeah, he worked throughout that whole time. But it was funny, during the race, a friend of ours got engaged. She had a huge diamond. And so I was like, hey, where's my diamond? And Jim looks me in the eyes and goes, hey, Beth, this campaign is your diamond. Anyway.
Well, one more thing I'll ask about your dad.
Yeah.
Your dad was the only person to serve as Speaker of the House and President of the Senate. Do you remember when he was elected Speaker of the House and Senate President?
Yeah. I remember both of them. And I guess I remember them the best because they were coalitions right off the bat. He was the first person to have done that. So in some polite society, he got pilloried, but in reality, it was just the smartest thing to do. And he worked well, as I said, with everybody. And I thought Mike Chenault, who was Speaker for a long time when I was minority leader, I thought Mike Chenault might be a guy who could do that because he had a similar, he might fight you on the floor, but the minute you get off the floor, he's talking to you and it goes right back to being the same kind of person. And he was a quite fair speaker. But it's hard. It's hard to do that. I don't know who's going to do it again, but yes, he's the only one to have done that. And it speaks well to, it was very nice. David Ramsar, who worked in the governor's office a long time, and then he's now like the one of the historical society, was president last year, wrote a very nice note about my dad when he died. And he said he was a very popular man. And he cared about people so deeply and he listened to people. He really was thoughtful that way.
You left Alaska to go to college. You went to Stanford and then you became a lawyer.
I went to Santa Clara Law. Yeah.
Santa Clara for law school. And then came back to Alaska. And I guess first question, why Juneau? Why'd you come back to Juneau?
Oh, what happened originally is I went back to Anchorage because I was a clerk to one of the Alaska's most amazing judges ever, brilliant man, Alex Brenner. So I became a clerk for Alex and worked in Anchorage for quite a long time. I became a public defender and I was a trial lawyer. And during those days, we didn't have enough budget to cover everybody full time. So everyone had to take 4 months off. And so I used it to go work in Juneau. I had friends that went to Fiji, but I went to Juneau those years. And what happened was I went to a Democratic Party fundraiser. We always had a yearly auction in those days. And it was just a blast, right? It was at the American Legion up the hill from the Baranoff. And my mom was there with a friend from the Matanuska Valley, Mary Combs, who was a leader in the Democrats. We were all there. And I go with my mom. I was sitting next to a guy who was also a friend, and he got up and left the table for a little while. And he was with another friend. So the other friend, Jim, and I started talking, and I never believed in this, but within 5 minutes, I knew this is a guy I really wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And that's what happened. He was in Juneau. So I went back. I had promised my dad I would campaign that summer. So I went back to Palmer and campaigned. And then I came back to Juneau and went to work at the Attorney General's office. And that was it.
When did you decide to run and why?
We were raised in so much politics. And I became a lawyer because my dad wanted me to become a lawyer. And it's not that I didn't enjoy being a lawyer, but
why did he want you to be a lawyer?
Immigrant family, first generation American. He wanted a lawyer and a doctor. And my sister became a doctor, but he had in mind a medical director, although he was absolutely proud of her for what she's done. She worked at the National Science Foundation. She was always supported Indigenous people and their rights and the saving of language. And so she was quite a force in her world. But at any rate, that's why I did it. And then I was in Juneau at the AG's office. And Kim Elton, who was then in the House seat, decided to run for the Senate. And I just knew. I knew it. I knew that was my time. If I didn't do it, it was an open seat in Juneau, which, as you know, only comes open once a decade, or I stayed 15 years. And so when it's open, you better take the opportunities. I knew I wanted to run, and I ran.
You've been serving in the legislature with your dad by just a couple years.
I know. And I'm glad. If my father had been in the legislature, I never would have run. I wouldn't have felt the need. And I guess I'm not glad. I always wish that certain people could have stayed in forever. And of course, he's one of them. Clem would have probably been another one. But as he was gone, and as my husband ran first, my husband, the year after my dad lost, which was traumatic on all of us, Kim decided he was
like at the moment. When your dad lost, was that like the moment that like the Matsu is Republican?
Yeah.
And then from
took him in Babcock, reapportioned the entire state. And it was devastating. The state was largely Democrat. And then, I don't deny him that he was intelligent, but it was a horrible thing to do to Alaska. Because in those days, it was so much more evenly balanced. And then it just went totally Republican. Yeah. Many people lost their seats. It was a very hard thing to happen. I will say Jim Duncan really went to bat for my dad and saved my parents and finances at least. My dad became a no-brainer director of agriculture then for a while.
You said your husband ran.
Oh, here's what happened. Yeah, sorry. What happened was we're sitting on, it doesn't exist anymore, but there was a really pretty little old building in Juneau, and we'd often meet there and go eat our lunches. And so we're eating lunch, and Jim, he doesn't even give me a chance to say no. I'm going to run for assembly. And I'm like, I just started bawling. I was like, oh no, I can't take another race. And he's going, I'm going to do it. And then of course I came around. His best friend and I ran that race, and Jim worked as hard as he could. And Jim was in Juneau, a bit of an outsider. He's married to me, but still, if you hadn't been in Juneau for like your whole life at that point, you didn't get elected. So he ran, and by God, he just outworked the other person, and he won. And then he was in for 9 years, but he had been in, I believe, 3 at the time I ran. Yeah, when I ran.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. So he was on the Juneau Assembly while you were in the House.
Well, my mother said we were crazy, but that's true. He ran again and was in for another 6 years. And my mother said they're not going to let that happen. Juneau's very liberal, and they just want the best people, I think. Jim continued to be reelected, even though my mother was right. We were crazy in those days. We were a lot younger. Oh, my God, though. I remember, maybe people will forgive me for this. So I remember my first couple of years in the legislature that I never did laundry. I just was so busy, and I didn't want to do it. So this pile of laundry just kept building. And I would do things like go to Costco and buy new underwear. It was like, I didn't care. It was pretty awful. So anyway, you do things like that when you're young.
I got involved in politics because I was all municipal politics all the time.
There you go.
So it's still, this will come as no surprise to any listener. I still watch a lot of assembly meetings, Anchorage assembly meetings.
Sure.
I'm probably outside my lane some of the time. And I think I sometimes probably offer my opinion or overstep a little bit in terms of what I think should be happening or not. I don't know. Do you have any advice? Like, what was it like with Jim being on the assembly and you being in the House? And what was the conversations at home about?
There's 2 or 3 parts to this answer, and it's an important answer. I don't think anybody ever does anything right or wrong in these situations, right? It's just what you're comfortable with and what you have to offer. Jim and I talked all the time, but we had definitely things that he was involved with, as you say, on the city level, and me on the state. But what I learned early on was if there was ever a call at 9:00 at night on a Sunday, it was always for Jim. And if we ever went to the grocery store, 90% of it was for Jim because we're working on an oil tax that people understand it, but they don't want to hear the fine points, right? They just say, oh, I'm so glad you're doing that. And with Jim, it was like, why aren't you taking care of that sewer line? And my neighbor is like really violating the law. The lower down you get, the more personal it is. So it was fascinating to me that way. But I will say this. People will ask me what the advice was my dad would give me. They'd ask me, what Jay say about this? And I say, my dad doesn't ever give me advice. And if I ask him for something, he'll say, I don't really know what's happening, but maybe this. And I think it's because he was right. He had such a high respect for the office and for the fact I'd been elected. And he also knew, and this happened pretty quickly with me, you don't know unless you're there, right? You don't know all the magnitudes of everything happening. Now, I believe it's easier with an assembly. I don't think you're wrong at all to be paying attention and helping. And hey, if the person doesn't want to hear it, fine, they can tell you, but I think that's good. But I think once you get to the state level, it just gets so much more internecine and more difficult. And he realized that. And he was really good about it. Although I always wished he would have told me more because he was very strategic and thoughtful, but he was right.
When he said that he didn't know what was happening, did your mom and dad stop watching?
No, it wasn't that. It was that he knew that the issue is the issue. And we could talk issues all day long, but he also knew he didn't know the players. He didn't know the different machinations of inside who I needed to help, who I didn't need to help, where my district was at. Rick Halford, I was very lucky that Rick Halford was almost always in the building or close by during those days. And Rick was John Davies, who was a rep from Fairbanks, and Rick Halford, who had been senator.
Republican from Bristol Bay.
No, he actually was Eagle River, but he lives in Bristol Bay now. Yeah. And I was missing him the other day. Now I'll have to call him, but he and John Davies were probably my most important mentors in life. And Rick did have his finger on the pulse. So my first 4 years were charmed. He was resources chair and then Senate president. And I'd known him my whole life. So I just go in the office, and some days I'd do a face plant on his couch and start yelling about somebody. And he'd just sit and work.
15 years you served in the House. What are your most memorable moments?
There are so many. I got to work with wonderful people. I think people ask me if I miss it, and I guess I don't really miss all the day-to-day, all the stuff, but I miss the people. Funny moments. Like my whole first year, and I did for 3 more years. For 4 years, I sat next to John Davies, who's a PhD volcanologist. He helped run the Cold Climate Center in Fairbanks. Brilliant man. And his wife, Linda Shandelmeyer, they're equally political as my parents were. Anyway, John sat next to me. So my whole first session, I came out of being a lawyer, right? So I'd written all kinds of amendments, all the laws. I knew how to do it. So my first session, John would turn to me in the middle of debate or something. He'd say, hey, Beth, could you do this amendment? And so I just sit there and do an amendment for him and give it to him. And then I'd watch all freaking hell break loose. And of course, I'd have my name on it. And I'm like, what just happened to me? I was quite arrogant. I thought I knew everything. And of course, the minute you get on the floor, you realize, this is a different deal. So let's fast forward. Beginning of my second year, John and I are sitting down, having a good time. And the first debate starts, and John's going fast. And he says to me, hey, Beth, could you write this amendment? And I sat, watched. And then John's, hey, where's that amendment? And I looked at him and go, Mikey's not doing it anymore. Right? He started laughing so hard. I think it was Brian Porter was speaker, and he used his father's nightstick, and he banged that thing down, and I'm like, anyway, John was still laughing.
So Brian Porter used his dad's nightstick. What was his dad was a police officer?
His dad was a cop, and so was Brian. Brian was amazingly good. He was chief, and he was a really good policeman. And many times as a trial attorney, I'd run up against his work and it was like, then you're lost, right? Because he was such a good police officer. But at any rate, he used the nightstick, which is a little hard on your ears. But Brian didn't hear well. So that it never bothered him. So anyway, that's one of my favorite ones as you start to figure it out. There were a lot of others. Mary Peltola and I served for her entire 10 years and just so many funny memories with Mary, funny things that would happen, or very proud memories of Mary standing up to racism. Just, she was so strong and brilliant and just a wonderful leader. And I remember some pretty bad days that she had to stand up to it. And
do you remember a specific story?
Yeah, I remember a specific story. I'm not going to use names, but during a finance meeting, there was I'm not going to remember all the facts, right? But it's right around the same time that there was a horrendous joke that went on air, on the radio, about how to be a real Alaskan, it used to be that you have to sleep with an Indigenous woman and urinate in the Yukon. It was horrible. And Mary spoke against that, but she also, during a finance meeting, there was some indication of women, Native women in particular, asking for how they were being abused. And Mary just went right to it. She didn't even hesitate. She didn't call her the knees. She just called it out. And then that was I don't remember why, but someone told me I should get up there. And I just ran and saw the end of it. And she had done a good job. So those were important memories to me. And working with Eric Croft and Ethan Berkowitz, of course, John, a guy named Tom Bryce. On the Republican side, Ralph Samuels and I sat across from each other. My father and Ted Stevens were minority and majority leader, just as Ralph and I were. And they were always passing notes. And Ralph and I similarly would pass notes. And someone took a picture of our last day and it said a note going across. And it was just, those are fun memories. And Ralph finally got up and he said, you probably think we're discussing all kinds of serious issues, but actually we're talking about how hungry we are and what we're going to go eat. It was fun. Those were good memories.
You had a strong influence on me because when we were doing the resolution to support Willow, which the federal delegation had said that it needed to be unanimous, there were a few of us who were on the fence who were like, I don't know if I really want to sign a resolution saying that I 100% want more oil development on the North Slope. And you said that we called, and I think it was our first conversation. I never met you.
You did call me. You were so strong. I was so impressed.
We talked because you said that you had done a similar vote early in your career and that you felt it locked you into voting against development forever and ever. And that there were all these votes where it was you were all by yourself. And that really had an impact on me where I was like, it's just a resolution. I can vote on a resolution.
Yeah. And I believe another legislator called me too. Yeah. Here was what happened. It was my first session and the ANWR resolution came up. And I had always been against opening ANWR. And I knew my district was fine with that. In fact, they would have wanted me to do that. But I also knew that it would keep me from ever running for higher office in Alaska. I could never have run for U.S. Senate or governor or anything, having taken that one vote. And you're right. In a lot of cases, I voted against bad development, not things that were reasonable. But I knew that one vote was going to do that. And I stayed up literally all night talking to my sister, Anna, about that vote because I wanted any kind of out to it because I knew what was going to happen. And Anna, who was so very strongly aligned and taught me so much about Indigenous culture, Indigenous people, and about Indigenous rights, finally, at the end of the night, she gave me all the reasons why I should vote against it. And then at the end of the night, it's 6 a.m. her time, she goes, you know what, Beth? bottom line is you won't be able to look yourself in the face if you voted for it. And then she hung up the phone. I went, shit. So I spent the next 2 hours before session just boning up again. And then, oh my God, I got up and just gave this barn burner of a speech on a resolution. And that was it. That was it. It was over then. So from then on, I was truly locked in on ANWR. But there were times when I did not get up and give a barn burner speech, but I would never sign it because I also was funny. When I first ran, my dad said, you got to pick an issue and you got to be all for it. And that's your issue. And I went, okay, what could that be? And because I was much more of a servant legislator. It wasn't like I ran on one specific issue, but I brought education in a lot. And what I found when I got elected is I'm really an environmentalist. Those became the issues, human issues and environmental issues. And so once that vote got taken, I think at the end of the day, in a karmic way, that was the vote that kept me from running for higher office. But it was also the vote that had me wind up becoming President Obama's director of the Ocean Council.
Which is why you left the legislature in 2014. You left the legislature in 2014 because you went to Stanford to be a fellow with the Center for Ocean Solutions.
That's right.
And then a few months later, President Obama, they had just created the National Ocean Council.
It had been in for a couple of years, but it was still just beginning to do its work. Yeah, it was wild. When I went to interview for that job, I'm like, there is no way in hell I'm getting this job. But then once I interviewed, and Dr. Holdren, who was the chief scientist, that was overwhelming, believe me. Talking to a Nobel Prize winner for a position was pretty wild. But he loves Alaska. And all of a sudden I started thinking, well, I might get this job.
You got it. And what I found most interesting in researching for the interview was that while you were at the National Ocean Council, NOC, you implemented the National Ocean Plan and coordinated the nation's first two regional marine plans for New England and the Mid-Atlantic, which I just think as an Alaskan, right. Why were you doing Mid-Atlantic and
right.
England?
Oh, so exasperating and such a great question. There's a coastal zone program that covers the coastline of the United States. And states have a very big say in what happens to federal projects. Alaska, we lost it. We lost it on one vote. One of the reasons why at some point you just have to say this is over for me. But we lost the sunset vote on that bill to reinstate our coastal program by one vote, one lousy vote. And I got up, you'll know this. People on reconsideration, they'll ask for it, but they won't get real demanding. But I got up on reconsideration right after that vote and said, we're going to vote again, because I wanted the people who had voted against it to be on the record hard. I didn't want them later. Oh, I didn't mean that. I'm like, yeah, no way. You knew. Anyway, we lost it. So the state with the largest coastline and the rest of the country put together didn't have a coastal zone program. So it was disheartening to me in a sense. But what happens is that those New England states and even the Mid-Atlantic, they've all been working together for so long. And they have these little tiny, New Hampshire has a 13-mile coastline. It's
wow,
like
I didn't even know New Hampshire had a coastline.
It's a joke. Anyway, sorry, New Hampshire. I have many friends from New Hampshire. But at any rate, they're all used to working together, right? Since the colonies. And by the time I got there, they were way out ahead. And I enjoyed working with the leaders there. Unfortunately, they had very little tribal influence because they literally had to go find tribal people because they'd all been sent to Oklahoma, where my mom was from. They'd all been sent all over the country. And so those states were just way out front. That's why by the time I got there in the ocean plans, it was obvious that they were going to be the first two. I did work very hard, though, with California and with the West Coast tribes. In fact, one of the things I'm most proud of is we created a governance committee for the Ocean Council of Indigenous leaders and state and local leaders. And that was I guess it was the first time. It's also the ocean program. One of the reasons I decided, I wanted to do it was because it was the first time that Indigenous people weren't just at the table, they were part of the decision making. So that was a really amazing experience. I learned a lot. I had a great time bringing Alaska to DC. By the end of my time there, I felt people understood a little more about Alaska. I was only there 2 years. That was my stint. And then fortunately, Dr. Holden asked me if I would stay. But my mother had a stroke while I was there, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't lose both parents while I was in DC.
I looked at the statement when you got your honorary doctorate
Oh,
from the University of Alaska Southeast a
you
couple of
had
years
done
ago.
your homework. Yeah.
And it said that while you're proud and committed to Alaska, that your greatest role as a family caregiver for your parents.
Yeah. Thank you for recognizing that. My parents were great parents. I learned so much and it was hard, but I had the rare opportunity to get to be with both of my parents for long periods of time as they were elder and leaving us. They were both incredibly brave, wonderful people. And I miss them every day. The thing I'm the most proud of in the legislature wasn't all those oil and gas bills. It wasn't always a fight on an environment. It was the fact that during my first session, a woman came in and she was dying of liver failure. And our insurance wouldn't cover her costs. And if she hadn't gotten outside for an operation, she would not have lived. And so I was still a lawyer at that point. And so I just called and argued. And by God, they got her the treatment. And she came up many times after that to talk on issues. But I was always so happy to see her alive. And that was really my proudest moment, was helping her live. We have a strong family, and I've always been taught that family came first. And I think my staff would all say that they knew that. Thanks, Andrew. I know how much you care about your family, and it's just a joy to have you have mentioned that. So,
are you retired now?
Yeah. And retired is a euphemistic way for saying I don't get paid for what I do. I'm still involved in Alaska politics pretty heavily. Both Jim and I participate more behind the scenes, fundraising. Mary Peltola is my dear friend, and I worked as hard as I could for her to get elected, and I'm going to do it again because she should absolutely continue in Congress. I love helping and being with people like you. I haven't been around the legislature much, and maybe I'll come down this year. In fact, I've never come on the floor during my time. Senator Keel did an in memoriam for my dad, and maybe I'll come down and we'll have a little tea or something. That would be lovely.
I do ask everyone at the end of the program if they want to recommend a book.
I have a book.
You do?
What? Yes, but I have to mention one quick last thing, and that is I do work I was the president. Now I'm the immediate past president of our National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, which I very want to bring you and other people.
I need to be involved. I'm sorry.
Yes, you'd be wonderful. But okay, I have 2 books. Do I have time to show them to you?
Yes.
Okay, I'll be right back. There they are. See, I haven't finished either of them, which is a shame, but here they are. Okay. So the harder read is this one, The Ministry for the Future. And I quit reading it midway, and I'm going to have to pick it up, but it just got into my psyche. It's all about climate change in the future. And some of the political battles they talk about are just so true now that it started terrifying me. So I'll send you the link.
Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson.
That's it. And it was one of President Obama's favorite books of the year. Now,
awesome.
On a completely different level. So I grew up on a farm. My dad loved animals. I love animals. We were an animal family. So it's Susan Orlean on animals. It is hilarious.
Yeah, she's such a funny writer.
But I am telling you, she not only pegs the animals, she pegs the people. And it is a hoot.
Oh, thank you
Just
so much for
great.
that recommendation. I knew she had a new book, but I hadn't read it or picked it up. And so this is going to make me do it.
Yeah, on animals. Yeah, it's just a great book.
Beth Kerttula, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You've made my whole week. I've loved speaking with you. It's such a joy.
Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. If you'd like to contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com.